In the penultimate decade of the 19th century, Otto von Bismarck was at the height of his power. Domestically, his chancellorship was secure with the firm support of the aged Kaiser Wilhelm. Internationally, his diplomatic system appeared to have achieved a near total hegemony over European politics. Austria and Russia, the two other great empires on the continent, were bound to Germany through a revived Three Emperors League. Italy remained friendly via the new Triple Alliance, whilst France, though irreconcilably adversarial, was isolated and quarantined. Potential hiccups were always on the horizon, of course. Habsburg and Romanov still bickered over the Balkans. France might at any point escape its segregation or launch a war of revenge, but Bismarck enjoyed the challenge these problems offered, and in 1882 his iron grip on international politics expanded still further. That year, hoping to restore the Khedive to power in Egypt, British forces had occupied the country. Instead of evacuating a few weeks later as expected, the Prime Minister, William Gladstone, found that maintaining the Khedive in power required locking British troops in a semi-permanent residency. Unfortunately for London, doing so came at the price of alienating one of its key partners in Europe. Throughout the 1870s, France and Britain had often cooperated in international affairs via an informal liberal entente. But Paris held enormous interests in Egypt, and Britain's unilateral occupation was perceived to be a humiliation almost as unforgivable as Germany's annexation of Alsace-Lorraine 12 years before. Combined with Whitehall's perennial hostility to Russia over the Straits and Gladstone's sporadic denouncements of both Austria and Turkey as disreputable autocracies, Britain was left entirely dependent on German goodwill to avoid complete isolation in Europe. Like any good patriot, Bismarck was happy to use this power to Germany's advantage, the most glaring example of which was when he forced Britain to back down over a range of colonial claims. Now, the seriousness of the British position here can be overlooked, as this was the only real obvious display of Bismarck wielding his new power so blatantly. Indeed, on a personal level, he didn't really bear Britain any ill will, yet the threat of blackmail hung over Whitehall like a dark cloud. When Gladstone left office in 1885 and was replaced by the Marquess of Salisbury, Britain's situation was exceptionally grim. With no friends on the continent, dependent almost entirely on Bismarck's patronage, the new Prime Minister was horrified that all it needed was for Germany to swing against London and a general partition of Britain's empire would be on the cards. Of course, something this drastic was not remotely desired by Bismarck, but the unspoken threat made the situation incredibly dangerous for London and profitable for Berlin. This then was the setup for the next 5 years of Anglo-German relations. Salisbury hoped, indeed had to, wriggle Britain off the diplomatic hook she was on. Bismarck wanted to keep her there. To begin with, the Iron Chancellor took little notice of Britain's new Prime Minister, the obstinate lay clergyman, as he had described Salisbury when the two met 7 years earlier at the Congress of Berlin. And it's not difficult to see why. Salisbury's first ministry lasted only 6 months, as the British political system almost tore itself apart over the Irish Home Rule question. The split in Gladstone's Liberals on the issue meant Salisbury was back in office by July 1886, though even then it was another 5 months before he could take the Foreign Office as well and truly establish his dominance over British policy. This background context is somewhat important to keep in mind when imagining why Bismarck was often exasperated by the British political system and initially underestimated the new Prime Minister. Salisbury's first task was to restore for Whitehall some freedom of action in international affairs, and fortunately the opportunity soon presented itself. On the 18th of September 1885, the ruler of Bulgaria, Prince Alexander, announced a union between his country and Eastern Rumelia. Salisbury had engineered the separation of the two states in 1878 at the Congress of Berlin, for Bulgaria had at that time been a Russian client. But Prince Alexander had since then shown himself to be independent of St. Petersburg's influence, and thus there was now a switch in positions. Salisbury, after some initial scepticism, quietly supported the new union. Russia vigorously opposed it. What gave Salisbury his opening, though, was the fact that Austria, after some confusion and dithering, also ended up supporting the union in defiance of the Tsar. Bismarck, an ally of both, wouldn't dare risk destroying his system by choosing one over the other. The result was that Vienna had to look to Britain rather than Germany for support in the Balkans. This is a complex bit of diplomacy, and frankly sources often disagree on what actually went on, but the basic point is that Salisbury had used the Bulgarian issue to drive a wedge between the Three Emperors League and bring about a reconciliation with Austria, which had until then been seething at Gladstone's regular denouncements of them. The Prime Minister had, for now, given Britain some room to manoeuvre. In November, the Serbs declared war on Bulgaria, searching for territorial compensation. On the 19th, they suffered a crushing defeat and had to be rescued by their Austrian ally. The victory essentially secured Bulgarian unification. The French and Italians, who had previously backed Russia's desire to uphold the split, now withdrew. Salisbury subsequently moved to secure recognition of the union from the Sultan, who was, at least in theory if not reality, still the country's sovereign. This finally forced the Russians to acquiesce. British policy in the Balkans had triumphed. In Europe, her prestige was suddenly restored. It would be wrong to say that Bismarck was outdone here. The Iron Chancellor had in fact simply elected not to play at all, to the extent Salisbury actually felt he had ended up pulling German chestnuts out of the fire. For now, the Three Emperors League survived. Both Austria and Russia ultimately remained committed to it. Nonetheless, in 6 months, Salisbury had manoeuvred Britain out of isolation and given her once more a respected voice in the European concert. His success had to an extent been based on luck. A Balkan squabble rearing its head was always going to be the best way to drive a wedge through the Three Emperors League and restore good relations with Austria. But it had taken Salisbury to ride that luck. A statesman cannot create anything himself. He must wait and listen until he hears the steps of God sounding through events, then leap up and grasp the hem of his garment, so said a certain Otto von Bismarck. As John Charmley notes, prestige counts as a weapon in international affairs. When Salisbury came to the Foreign Office, he had to act without it. By the time he left, he had acquired it. It was a currency Bismarck more than anyone understood and respected. From then on, he would be far less dismissive of the British Prime Minister. This part of the Bulgarian squabble had taken place during Salisbury's brief government of 1885. When he returned to office in mid-1886 at the head of a more stable ministry, he was welcomed by Bismarck. The Prime Minister's aim was now to build on his previous success by maintaining close relations with Germany, but ultimately escaping her patronage. He wanted to do this by working out a settlement with France over Egypt and restoring good relations with the Ottoman Empire, which had again been damaged by Gladstone. But he was now opposed by his own Chancellor, Randolph Churchill. He too wanted good relations with Bismarck, but thought the solution was a formal alliance with Germany, which would then allow him to cut defence spending. This idea horrified almost everyone in the Tory party, not least Salisbury himself. Defence cuts and then a formal alliance would effectively make Britain a permanent German satrap, unable to ever act independently or threaten force. Salisbury wanted to work with Bismarck, but his priority was to maintain Britain's freedom of action at all times. Churchill's proposals quickly lost him all support within the Tory party, and Salisbury was able to turn an attempted resignation bluff against him with little trouble. Yet, if the Prime Minister had secured his domestic standing, internationally he was still on shaky ground. Even though France and Germany were currently experiencing a period of heightened tensions, to the extent that war was being predicted in several quarters, Paris still refused any settlement whatsoever over Egypt, and the Ottomans also proved adverse to a renewal of the old alliance. Because of this, Salisbury would for now remain dependent on Germany. In the end, the solution came from southern Europe. The problem here for Bismarck was that Russia's trajectory was inevitably expansionary, towards Constantinople and then the eastern Mediterranean itself. In August 1886, a group of Russian-backed officers had kidnapped Prince Alexander, who soon after abdicated. The split between Vienna and St. Petersburg over the whole Bulgarian crisis made him fearful the Three Emperors League would be terminated when it came up for renewal in 1887. Its restraining influence on Russia would collapse and they would once again end up in direct conflict with Austria. Supporting one or the other could bring his system down, but doing nothing could lead to an open clash between his allies. The answer, thought Bismarck, was to have Britain pull his chestnuts out of the fire again. If they supported Austria in the Mediterranean and Balkans, Russia would be deterred, or at least squabble with somebody that was not Germany. He could preserve his friendship with Vienna without having to commit himself against St. Petersburg on her behalf. Salisbury knew this gave him leverage, although he thought an agreement with Austria and Italy would be helpful for Britain anyway. To start with, he held back. What would Bismarck offer Britain if she joined an Austro-Italian bloc in the Mediterranean? The Chancellor's answer was that he would support Britain in its occupation of Egypt. Though a relatively minor concession for Bismarck to make, for Salisbury it was a great coup that now left France as the one isolated in its hostility to the British occupation. The terms of the First Mediterranean Agreement, a series of secret notes rather than formal treaty, were deliberately vague, but they basically amounted to Italy, Austria and Britain agreeing to cooperate if Russia were to make any serious moves towards the Straits. Bismarck had ultimately achieved his aim of tying London to Vienna, and he was quick to try and use the concession he had made over Egypt to his advantage, suggesting, or perhaps more correctly pressuring, Britain to commit to maintaining the occupation for the foreseeable future, a quicksand Salisbury really sought to escape as soon as was convenient. When he wants us, as he evidently does, to quarrel with France downright over Egypt, I think he's driving too hard a bargain, muttered Salisbury. Egypt is a disastrous inheritance, for it enables the Chancellor to demand rather unreasonable terms as the price, not of his assistance, but of his refusal to join a coalition against us. Nonetheless, the First Mediterranean Agreement had allowed Salisbury to put Britain on a firmer ground internationally. Austria and Italy were now friendly, even if their formal commitments to cooperation only extended to the Mediterranean, and Salisbury was able to justify the arrangement to the Queen by arguing it was the best means of warding off a continental league. In this assessment he was right. Even after the brief revival of serious Franco-German tensions had died down in 1888, Bismarck refused to effect a more serious détente with France. Doing so would mean reversing course and supporting Paris's position over Egypt, which would then lose Austria Britain's support in the Mediterranean and Balkans, potentially creating an Austro-Russian crisis. This was a diplomatic house of cards, but in some sense, one Salisbury had stacked in his favour. France and Russia's hostility to Britain still gave the Iron Chancellor options, but Britain could no longer be blackmailed by the implicit threat of a continental coalition anymore. What crowned Salisbury's success and turned the whole situation on its head was the Second Mediterranean Agreement in late 1887. By this point, Bismarck's Three Emperors League had collapsed, not least because of the wedge Salisbury had driven into it over the Bulgarian issue. Germany replaced it instead with the new bilateral reinsurance treaty where Russia was concerned and the maintenance of the Triple Alliance with Austria. Formal Austro-Russian cooperation thus broke down, and St. Petersburg resumed a threatening attitude towards Bulgaria. Mixed with a combined Franco-Russian effort to torpedo a British convention with the Sultan, it seemed like an aggressive new alliance between the two, aimed at the Balkans and the Straits, might be in the offing. Although Salisbury was annoyed by the destruction of his efforts to reconcile with the Turks, it was no longer a vital issue for Britain. The possibility of a Franco-Russian alignment aimed at the Balkans was far more worrying for the Triple Alliance, Bismarck included. The Second Mediterranean Agreement was proposed to Salisbury and pressed on him by Bismarck because of this. Unlike the first, where Salisbury was trying to escape isolation, here there was no obvious danger that meant Britain had to accede, and so the Prime Minister played a waiting game. As discussed, Bismarck had remained aloof from the earlier negotiations, keen to let Britain take on the burden of defending Austria. But back then, Britain had been isolated. Now it was Bismarck on the hook, and Salisbury had a price for letting him off. What, the Prime Minister inquired, exactly were Bismarck's commitments to Austria? When it really came down to it, if there was a genuine Austro-Russian flare-up, which of his allies would Bismarck support? The Chancellor replied with a 20-page document which can basically be summed up in one word: Austria. Germany would not allow Austria to be dismembered. For Salisbury, this was everything he needed to know. Until then, he was never exactly sure what Bismarck would do in a European war. Now he could safely commit to the Second Mediterranean Agreement, knowing he was effectively tying Germany, though she made no formal commitment, to a bloc meant to bar Russian expansion. Bismarck had always wanted to make it seem like he would never pick between Austria and Russia, and publicly that remained the case, but in private Salisbury now knew better. In little over 2 years, he had escaped international isolation, erected a formidable barrier to any Russian aggression, and wriggled Britain off Bismarck's diplomatic hook. He had done so without sacrificing British interests, or making commitments that were in conflict with those interests. For Bismarck, the opposite was true. He'd started off by being able to blackmail Britain into giving up its colonial claims. He'd ended up in turn being blackmailed by Britain into giving up the secrets of his Austrian alliance, and thus committing Germany to fight Russia, if it came down to it. It was not a great defeat. It hardly destroyed the Bismarckian system, nor did it prove a barrier to friendly relations with Britain. Indeed, Bismarck now spoke of Salisbury's friendship as being worth more than 1,000 African swamps. But it was the type of vexation Bismarck was unaccustomed to. The Iron Chancellor was losing his grip, not just on foreign policy, but the course of the German Empire. His patron, the old Kaiser, was dying, soon to be replaced by the forceful Wilhelm II. A new era of European diplomacy was about to begin, but Salisbury had ensured Britain would enter it with a strong hand.